For more on this, we are being joined by Kunal Sarogi. He is a market expert joining us from New Delhi. Welcome, Kunal. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. Let me start by asking, how can the government balance rationalizing subsidies with ensuring social welfare?
Well, I think it's a tough balancing act. It's because it's important in a country like India. It's important to keep the subsidies going. That's the real fillip to industry, to various segments of the society. So I think the government has to do this balancing act, but the subsidies have to be targeted. We've seen a lot of improvement in the impact these subsidies have ever since direct benefit transfer came into effect. So I think if you look at the overall structure, we are improving, and but the subsidy burden on some segments is growing, and that's, I think, is putting a drag on the economy. So what we need to do is to do this balancing act. Subsidies have to bring about economic growth and have to bring about relief to segments of society that is otherwise left out in the economic development. So I think the government has to do that, and they've been doing a very good job of actually doing it. The trouble here is that how efficiently can we leverage technology to deliver subsidies? We've seen that there's been a big push on that from the government, and I think that it will continue in the years to come. And if that goes on, I think subsidies will become more targeted and will end up with the right beneficiaries. So I think overall, there's been a lot of growth. But the problem here is how do you balance that? So I think that's the biggest challenge that the government faces.
Right. Let me segue to my next question following what you just said. What steps should be taken to widen India's tax base effectively?
Well, I think it's a big debate is whether we have a big enough tax base. Of course, optically, it looks like a very small base that only a few crore people actually pay taxes. And rest of India is not paying taxes. But the real thing is, are we taxing the rich enough? So that's the bigger question to worry about. So I think it's my personal opinion that we have to rationalize our tax system. And we have to ensure that the middle class gets a tax relief, because middle class seems to feel that they are actually bearing most of the burden. So it has to be more equitable. And I think that middle class has to get a tax relief. The rich have to be taxed slightly more. And I think if you do that, that I think is in the interest of the overall economy. Widening of the tax base, I think, is a process. It cannot be done overnight. It will take time. It's a function of how the economy does and how people participate. So it will take time, and there is a limit to how far you can take that. So if you look at an overall picture, I think what we need to do is to rationalize the tax base, cut down on excessive breaks that we get to give, and I mean complications have to come down. It has to be made easier for the middle class to file their taxes. And I think if the middle class gets a break, that I think will spur consumption, as well as will be very positive for the markets.
Absolutely. And how crucial is targeted capital expenditure in reviving economic growth and, of course, creating jobs?
Absolutely crucial. I think the government needs to come into the forefront, because in a country like India, we've always depended on government spend to fuel economic growth. And there is a huge need for infrastructure in this country, and that's a place where only the government can take the lead. But of course, public and private partnership is one model to work with, and the government is doing a fairly good job. But I think we need to really speed things up. It's because we are still far behind other countries in terms of infrastructure. And if we really want our economy to grow rapidly, and for India to become a developed country, I think it's absolutely critical that we focus on infrastructure. And that is something where the government spending, I think, has a huge role to play. So I think, of course, the government will have to act as a catalyst and fuel economic growth.
Right. To put things in context for our viewers, do you think that the government should prioritize tax relief or focus on increasing tax compliance to boost revenues?
I think both should go hand in hand. I think compliance has improved dramatically in the last few years. We've seen huge new changes happen. And I think because of technology, because of everything being online, because of GST, it's becoming very, very difficult to remain non-compliant. So we've seen the segments of society, of the economy that were typically outside of the tax net have actually come into the tax net and are now contributing to the tax. But the trouble here is that along with the compliance, there should be some relief, because the sense is that people are paying very big taxes, but they're not getting enough support from the government. So we've seen a lot of HNIs and super HNIs migrate outside of India to other tax havens like Dubai and so on. So I think that has to stop, and tax structure has to be rationalized, and tax compliance has to be made softer and easier, and more technology oriented, so that it's easier for a person to file taxes. And at the same time, tax breaks is something that the market is clamoring for.
Right, and that leads me to my last question. How can monetary policy complement the budget in managing inflation while also supporting growth?
Well, I think it's important. I think there is a there are a lot of factors that contribute to that. We've seen what's happening in the US, and monetary policy is no longer an isolationist thing where one country or one central bank can decide. You have to work in tandem with what the other banks are doing. So the government and RBI have to work together to achieve that. And I think they're doing a fine job. I think RBI has done a tremendous job, given that in the last few years, they've seen a lot of pressures coming from the world over, but they've managed it well. So I think it's important. Monetary policy is a very, very important aspect of how the economy does overall. India has been able to defend its currency, I think, to a very large extent. So that again remains a challenge. Now with Trump coming into power in the US, I think a lot of things will change. So I think we'll have to wait and watch for another, let's say, 2 quarters before we know exactly where we're headed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mrs. Saraogi, for joining us on this show and sharing your perspective with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.